today to talk about early learning inventories. My name is Janice Keizer, and I will be kicking off our presentation today and then turning it over to our facilitator and our guest speakers. We have assembled a really strong panel of state leaders who have been instrumental in helping to select and implement early learning inventories in their states. This webinar is packed with great information, and we're excited to have you join us today. The agenda for the webinar includes an overview of the research that supports the use of early learning inventories and a facilitated discussion with state leaders about the early learning inventories used in their states. Before we adjourn today, again, I'd like to ask you to take a moment to complete a survey for us. The link to the survey will be displayed on the screen, so please don't leave until you've done that. Next, I'd like to give you a brief introduction to our speakers. Eboni Howard is a managing researcher, and Dr. Howard works for REL Southwest. She will be your facilitator and discussion moderator for today's presentation. Serene Yee is an education program consultant with the California Department of Education. Joe Manley is a kindergarten observation tool coordinator. He is with the Central Regional Cooperative in New Mexico Public Education Department. And Anne Olley, early educator advisor at the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Thank you so very much to our presenters for agreeing to be with us today. I went through this just briefly a few moments ago, but just a quick overview. The REL Southwest conducts its work in partnership with education stakeholders in 5 states in our region. Those are Arkansas, Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. Our research partnerships that are currently active are listed on your screen. We have a college and career readiness practice area, early childhood education, English learners, networked improvement communities, school improvement, and teacher preparation and professional development. The goal of today's session is to provide you with information about how 3 states selected and implemented early learning inventories. You may also be familiar with the term kindergarten entry assessment. We are using the 2 terminologies rather similarly. Our outcomes for today are that you would gain a better understanding of the different early learning inventories that are available. We want to increase knowledge of the benefits and barriers and challenges of different early learning inventories. We'd like to become more aware of the teacher professional development and other training requirements to implement selected early learning inventories. And we'd also like to take a look at and better understand the research on the use of early learning inventories that support student growth and learning. Again, we have a transcriber in the room, and the presentations will be transcribed and available as closed captioning if you should need that service. And with that, I would like to now introduce Dr. Eboni Howard.
Hello, thank you, Janice.
This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, this is Eboni Howard, and I will be providing an overview of the early learning inventories and a little bit about what the research says. I am a managing researcher at American Institute for Research and also part of the REL Southwest team. So early learning inventories, for short, an acronym ELI, is looking at assessing many things, and the questions that come around are assessing when, assessing what, assessing why, assessing for whom or what purposes, and assessing how. The history of assessment, or looking at these early learning inventories, is quite a long one. One of the definitions of assessments that's common is defining it as a method of gathering information in order to inform decisions that may be instructional, decisions that may be policy, decisions that may be funding-based. but it's a large part of many learning environments through preschool all the way through college. Most of the assessments that people are familiar with, you'll hear in elementary, and by mid-elementary and into high school, many students will spend days, if not weeks, in district and state assessments. When it comes to the early learning assessments, the history of there really started in the 1990s, and some people may share their age with me when they think back to the National Educational Goals Panel that developed a framework for understanding school readiness and what is it we thought that children should be ready to come prepared to when they start school in kindergarten or first grade. Since the 1990s and that National Educational Goals Panel, there's been several public and private investment in trying to understand children's learning at the start of school. What are the key skills that should have? What are the key developmental aspects that schools should be prepared for when children start formal schooling, often considered kindergarten, sometimes considered first grade. With that, a lot of questions about early learning assessment and early learning inventories have arisen, which I will go through during my presentation. First, the question of assessing when. When is the best time to assess young children? For many part of the history, it was thought not to assess young children, and it was best that any formal assessment shouldn't happen until later grades, often third grade. In the last decade, there's been a push for having assessments prior to or at the start of kindergarten year. And when we're talking about early learning inventories, that is what we're defining. Starting an inventory or assessing children right before they started kindergarten or right during the first few weeks or months of their kindergarten years. Nearly all states at this point have considered, developed, or implemented an early learning inventory, or they have other names that they'll use: early learning assessments, kindergarten entry assessments, kindergarten readiness assessments, school assessments, early learning inventory, which is the acronym we're using for this webinar, kindergarten entry, developmental profile, and many, many others. A big push for states to consider, develop, and or implement it has happened over the last 10 years, but definitely in the last 6-8 years when the U.S. Department of Education supported the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge grants, which encouraged many states to take a look at how they were collecting information that could inform decisions about young children when they started school. One of our polls, why don't we take up one of the first polls here, is just to get a sense of how many, we have our polls? There we go. How many states that you are currently in actually have an active early learning inventory or one of the other names that it may be going by. We have the live results coming in, and we see by majority, 90% of your states have an active early learning inventory. That's interesting. Yeah, so most of the states now do have an early learning inventory tool. When we looked across and scanned the inventories, some are mandatory. There are some that are voluntary, and there are some in which are unknown. It's a mixture of them. There's 10 states that are either don't have one or currently exploring them. Well, I've meant to ask you about the next poll. There we go. So 50-50 in terms of mandatory or voluntary. What are states assessing? Again, there is a range of the assessments that are happening here. Most are focusing on these 5 major domains of development. In some aspects, the majority of states, a majority of the early learning inventories are really focusing on the language, literacy, and mathematics. Although the other aspects of development for young children are considered crucial and vital important, not all assessments are able to validly assess them in a way that can inform decisions in the beginning of school. So most have focused on language and literacy. There is some also aspects where the validity of the tools have been challenged when it comes to thinking about special needs, linguistic diversity, and cultural background. So many assessments do have intention, for example, to assess those children who have special needs or those children who may be dual language, English language speakers or learners, and yet their ability to assess them are challenged. And I think some of our states will talk about that as well during our presentation today. Assessing for why is a big question, and it relates somewhat for the topic of what are the domains that you focus on and what are the populations, or to make sure that the early learning inventories are culturally sensitive and appropriate. Many states have multiple purposes for the tools that they use, and often their purposes are not clear. So there are many of the purposes that I've listed on the slide, such as screening, diagnostic, benchmarking, snapshot, documenting, or evaluating. All of these could be valid purposes for an early learning inventory. Yet not the same in the early learning inventory tool may at the same level achieve all of these purposes. Different tools sometimes are needed for different purposes. For example, people often get confused between using a tool for screening purposes to identify a group of students who may need particular education or needs or have a specific service needs, and you just want to give a quick screening tool to see if they might have the possibility of needing further assessment or further diagnostic tools. That's one way early learning inventories may be used. Another way early learning inventories may be used is to provide a snapshot to get a population view of all of your children in a state or all of your children in a district and say, overall, how do our children in this district look like when they start school? Do they meet specific performance standards? Do they have certain level of literacy skills? Those are 2 very different purposes, to have a screening tool or a large population snapshot tool, yet sometimes they get confused, and many states try to use one tool for multiple purposes. Research is very clear about not doing that. Another major question when it comes to early learning inventories is assessing for whom. Who is getting this information? As we defined assessment as defined as gathering information to make informed decisions, well, who are the population, who is the stakeholder that we want to make the decisions for? Are they for the decision-making of families? Is it the decision-making of teachers and assistant teachers in the classroom to inform their instruction? Is the information for principals or school administrators in order to make decisions about their district or the school and the resources they need? Is it for policymakers or advocates to show a success of a program or the evaluation of a program to show that it's making the impacts that investments hope they'll make? Understanding who will be getting the information for what decision-making purposes is a key thing in deciding about the early learning inventory. Again, it also relates to the multiple purposes, multiple audiences. Assessing how. How do you go about deciding the appropriate assessment tool to use? Whether or not you use one that is currently validated and is developed, or is it one that you create for your own state, for your own purposes? And then once you decide on a tool, whether it's one that's already developed or you create your own, how do you validate it for the specific purpose, for the specific audience, for the specific decisions that you would want to make? Those are major questions around early learning inventories, along with now that you have a tool, maybe you validate it to make sure that it's valid for the purposes and for the audience that you think is important. How do you go about actually implementing it? Who needs to implement? Who is going to be the assessors? For example, in many states, it's the kindergarten teachers themselves. How do they know how to use the tool appropriately and how they can work that in? They're often very busy schedules and busy days. Final question when it comes to early learning inventories is, then what do you do with the data? How do you make sure you have the data from the early learning inventory so that it can actually inform the decisions you wanted it to inform? Many places in many states will have the inventory, and then when it comes to actually reporting the data, using the data to go back out to the audience member of priority, whether that be teachers, families, principals, there's often a disconnect. So implementation issue is often a big thing to consider when you're thinking about early learning inventory measures. All of these relate to the challenges as we think about early learning inventories. And there's several books on the subject that have been done by the National Research Council on early childhood assessment, on early learning inventories, on literacy assessments that talk about not only the deep validity and research base of the topic, but also the challenges when it comes to implementing them. Some of them I raised during my conversation here, such as communicating the intended purposes of the tool to the right audience, making sure you have a process of continuously improving. So once you select the tool, you use the tool, then how do you make sure you go back to make sure the tool can get improved? Because it's not just a one point in time process, as I think some of our states today will talk about. The burden of using the tool, particularly if you plan to have your teachers use the tool, and what kind of professional development and training those teachers will need. Consistent administration, like any type of assessment tool, assess a lot of the issues with assessment comes not with the tool itself, but how it's actually being put to use, how it's actually being administered in a way that has fidelity. Questions about special population, I already mentioned about the use of the data. And where I often find is a miss in the literature is talking about the use of assessment in engaging parents. Now I took this is not a scientific research study at all. It's called a Google search. And if you were to do a Google search, I hope there was some laughter out there in the silence. If you were able to do a Google search around childhood assessments, one of the top hits is kindergarten assessments among parents. How do I prepare my children for school? How do I best prepare my children for kindergarten? What are kindergarten assessments? Why would schools be assessing my young child so early? That is bigger than first grade assessments, second grade assessments, third grade assessments, which we know there are many states that have standardized. And the next time Google tells us a lot of parents are looking for information about assessment, tends to be in high school entry, and college. So there's a lot of questions and concerns among parents and families when it comes to early learning inventories, early childhood assessments, kindergarten assessments, and school readiness, and how our states and districts actually engaging the parents in part of the process when they're creating their own early learning inventories. So now we'll turn to getting insights from our state colleagues and understand a little bit more about what tool they have used and whether they created their own tool or modified a tool that was in existence. We'll also look at who the tool is being used for and who is actually implementing the tool. And we'll have them address some of our questions about populations that it's being used for, such as special needs populations as well as dual language learning populations. We're going to start with our presentation with Joe Manley, and he is the coordinator of the Central Region Cooperative in New Mexico Public Education Department. And he will be followed by Anne Olley, the Early Educated Advisor at the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And finally, we'll have the California Department of Education with Serene Yee presenting. The order of our states is those who are more recent in the process of developing and selecting a an early learning inventory, to those who have been around the longest doing that, which is California Department of Education has been doing it for many, many years. The references are here, and I know you'll have access to the slides after the webinar. And I'll pause to see if there's any questions about my presentation before turning it over to Joe Manley.